afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. My name is Kim Finney, and I, along with my colleague Kathy Moxon, are the co-founders of the Rural Youth Catalyst Project. We're a working group of the Rural Assembly led by Whitney Kimball Coe. 50 years ago, in 1971, Congress passed the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18. This seemingly simple amendment took decades of hard advocacy and was part of a larger series of hard-won civil rights legislation. Beginning during World War II, young people began organizing for their right to vote with the phrase, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote." The fight for the right to vote was inextricably tied to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Vietnam War. A little known fact, in 1942, it was a Democratic congressman from the rural state of West Virginia named Jennings Randolph who first introduced federal legislation to lower the voting age. Congressman Jennings would introduce the bill 11 times. Congressman Jennings fiercely believed in the role that young people, and especially rural young people, play in our democracy. At the time, he remarked, "They possess a great social conscience, are perplexed by the injustices in the world, and are anxious to rectify those ills." Despite the current perceptions of the rural voter, rural young people have always been on the front lines in the fight for civil rights, both 50 years ago and today. Young people are exercising their right to vote at historic rates, yet not everyone has the same access to the ballot box, especially rural young people and specifically rural BIPOC youth. This afternoon, we are honored to collaborate with CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University, as part of their celebration and examination of the 26th Amendment entitled Fulfilling the Promise. Thank you, CIRCLE. Thank you, Abby and Alberto, for letting us join you. Together, we are honored to bring you this intergenerational panel of civil rights leaders from across the country. Today, you'll hear the perspectives of women that were part of the founding of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the newer voice of a fierce community organizer from Laredo, Texas, along with the expertise of CIRCLE's applied research on youth voting and civic engagement. This conversation is being moderated by two brilliant and powerful women that I'm honored to know, Marlene Plua and Amanda Furge-Shelby. Amanda is the Young Women's Leadership Program Director for the Children's Defense Fund, the Southern Regional Office, and the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative for Social and Economic Justice, where she directs the United Blackwell Young Women's Leadership Institute, a program that reached its 15th year in 2020. Amanda is dedicated to seeing young people, in particular young women of color, learn life lessons, control their own narratives, and lead while growing. Ms. Furge works as a writer, publishing her first collection of non-fictional stories about growing up in Mississippi, motherhood, and art, and is a multi-medium performing artist. I've had the honor of working with Marlene Plua for over a decade. She is the Climate and Clean Energy Coordinator for Stoic Energy Consulting and a Rio Grande Valley girl at heart. Marlene's advocacy work is fueled by her own personal narrative, growing up in a colonia, being raised by a single mother, and having worked as a migrant farm worker. Marlene knows firsthand the hardships perpetuated by racial inequities and poverty. Previously, she worked with Jolt Initiative, where she developed and managed strategies for engagement and impact, ranging from climate justice campaigns to leadership programming for Latinx youth. Marlene also worked with Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid for over a decade. She brings a wealth of knowledge in project management, collaborative partnerships, community advocacy on a local and statewide level, and creating robust campaigns, planning and representing the narrative of the borderlands and Latinx communities. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Amanda and Marlene and all of our panelists. And without further ado, I turn it over to you to lead the session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kim. You have been an incredible guiding light on this side. And so we appreciate you so much. We, on behalf of myself and Marlene, I want to thank the Rural Assembly, the Rural Youth Catalyst Project, and Circle for this opportunity to have this conversation on this platform with these incredible minds. So we're going to get right into it. Miss Mamie Cunningham, in summation, she first became involved in the civil rights movement as a student in 1964 at Russ College, where, along with other students from across the country, she began registering people to vote. Because of her work that summer, she was chosen as an observer to travel with Fannie Lou Hamer, Stokely Carmichael, Bob Moses, Robert Moses, who passed away recently, rest in peace, Reverend Ed King, and just so many of these civil rights giants that we honor and recognize. Her work has continued in social justice in public schools as a teacher and advocate, as well as in local government. So thank you, Ms. Cunningham, for joining us this afternoon. And then I have to bring in our local statistician for this conversation. Miss Abby is the Deputy Director of Circle. If you don't know who Circle is by now on this call, it's just a Google click away. She is, her Circle's research informs policy and practice for healthier youth development and a more inclusive democracy, and is part of Tufts University's Tisch College of Civic Life. I think when I met Abby, she was across the country, across the globe the last time we talked. So we are excited to hear what she's going to bring to this conversation as far as research and just her own opinion. And I'm going to turn it over to Marlene.
Well, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing and honor Carol Blackman, who is in her third year as the Senior State Organizing Manager in Mississippi for Black Voters Matter Fund. Her work is conducted statewide with organizational partners and allies to promote expanded democracy in the Black community. She manages more than 20 Black Voter Matter partners across the state. By expanding the capacity of these partners, Black Voter Matters promotes voter education, mobilization, voter registration, and active voter participation. She was also a senior consultant with Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative for Economic and Social Justice, and she has a long history of working for human rights, economic development, and social justice. She believes that when we work together, we all win, and that is so true, Carol. People power. And then I also have the pleasure of introducing Juan Ruiz, who's from the border region. He's a community advocate based in Laredo, Texas. He helped organize residents across Webb and Zapata counties to fight against the border wall, which led to the cancellation of 2 border wall contracts. He also has been a field organizer for the Rio Grande International Study Center, where he worked on the nexus of climate and civic engagement. And he currently is volunteering for Congressional Texas District 28 candidate Tania Benavidez' campaign. So we are so excited to have such a tremendous speakers today for a panel discussion. So with that, I think we can kick it off, Amanda, with the first question.
So our first question, considering the context of this conversation and how we're celebrating, I don't know, celebrating might be a trigger word, I don't know, but how we're acknowledging what has happened. And so I want to start by asking Ms. Cunningham and Ms. Blackman, because you two are extraordinary civil rights activists who have laid the pathway for young people like us to follow. Can you give us a bird's eye view of the role that rural people and rural young adults played in the fight for civil rights?
Carol, do you want to go first or you want me to go first? Amanda. The role that I played in the 60s as a student was influenced by people that came from other states into the rural area. We had just integrated schools some were integrated and some were in the process of being integrated. And these students were aware of issues, and they had come in contact with overt racism. And they were aware of what was going on as far as discrimination was concerned and the injustice in the state. And all we did, and all the students that came from other states, all they did was come in and go into the communities and made those people aware of the issues, because the older adults weren't aware of some of these issues that the students were having in school. We went, I guess, in my area, we went like from door to door. The students who came in had set up freedom houses in different areas, and we used those to really educate people and to get them involved. That continued for me. I mean, I went from that to the NAACP. I worked with SNCC. I worked with a local group called Voters League. And we were really proactive and not reactive. When we planned the 1964 convention with Bob Moses, who was a brilliant person, we had our own elections. We started the precinct, went from the precinct to the district, from the district to the state. We ran our own candidates, we did our own voting, and we were just new at it, but we learned. That's kind of how I got started, and where I continue to be working now with Carol, with the BBM, which is sort of what the same thing we were doing, because the main purpose then with BBM is getting people to vote and registering people to vote. And we do have young people. I was just telling her yesterday or this morning that we are working with a group of young people called the New Black Panther Party, that we're trying to get them involved in registering people and voting people.
Thank you for that, Ms. Cunningham. That was a history lesson. And now, Ms. Carol, I know you can, do your magic, but can you tell us, from your bird's eye view, the role that rural and rural young adults played and play in the fight for civil rights?
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. And thank you all for having me on this panel today. Well, I grew up in rural Mississippi in the county of Madison, and in an area called Canton. Even though we didn't really live inside the city, we still lived in a portion of Canton. And during the time when I was growing up, I heard a lot from my father and my grandmother about what was taking place in our community around civil rights struggles. And the main goal was to help Black people in the community register to vote. There was a lot of violence that was taking place. Ultimately, I remember that a number of Black people were beaten, churches were burned. And I recalled sitting somewhere listening to my father and my grandmother's conversation when they were talking about what her strategy would be to be able to register and vote. And they talked about taking possession of my older sister's Mississippi history book so that my grandmother, who we call Granny, could actually learn portions of the Mississippi Constitution and the preamble to that Constitution to help her prepare for the poll-test. And then I recall that there were these boycotts that took place in our community, that in our town, that really caused a lot of ruckus. And then by the time I was in high school, in the 11th grade, the voting age changed to 18. And so I recall one of our high school teachers, and teachers, you know, had a lot more flexibility back then. One of our high school history teachers decided, government teachers, that we needed to become engaged in the process. So he took us out one day and we actively went door to door. We had some minor training, but of course we didn't really know what we were doing. But he provided some minor training for us, and we went door to door asking people to register to vote, because by then the rules had changed, even though before that, a number of Black folk across Mississippi were entered into what was called the Sovereignty Commission files, which were files that were maintained and paid for by the legislature, the Mississippi State Legislature, so that they could keep tabs on Black folk who were trying to register to vote and who were getting other Black people registered to vote. I also remember that while I was 17, I was able to register to vote because in a couple months I was going to be 18. And so I've been voting ever since then. Now, a few years ago, I learned that I'm what they call a super voter. I vote whenever there's an election. I'm also a community activist in the sense that every professional job that I've had has been geared toward helping to build the power of African American people. And usually it's either through voting or demanding rights in communities where we live.
Wow, I hope you can hear the 1 million hands clapping for you and Miss Mamie, because there was so much history and just everything that y'all just said. I just saw two terms at the opposite end of the spectrum. I heard you say poll tax, which is something that so many people have no idea about or existed or what it was and what it did. Then I heard you say super voter, which is something you could easily become today, a super voter, if you want, you know. So that was so brilliant. Thank y'all for sharing that. I'm going to turn it over to Marlene so we can keep it rolling. Thank y'all for sharing that.
Yes, no, thank you so much to both of you. Just again, laying out the history and the work that you've been doing and why you got involved into this work. And I'm going to kick off the next question to both Abby and Juan. Really, you know, now that we heard from, you know, our extraordinary civil rights leaders, what brought you all to this work and what has sustained you to this work? Mm-hmm.
Take it, Juan.
Hi, thank you all for having me here today. It's really wonderful to be in a community with everyone here in this panel and everyone who's watching. One of the things that really stood out and from Carl that you said was, you know, that your grandmother believed to borrow the textbook to learn the preamble of the Constitution so she could recite it and get ready for the protest. You know, that resonated with me because my mom, one of the stories when she was little, really took when she was she's from the United States, but she grew up in Mexico and she came to the United States much later in her life. So she didn't know English, but she in social studies and she had to memorize the preamble, and she always speaks of that moment and that when she was able to recite it with so much pride, because it was part of that civic engagement and part of being able to even if you don't know the language and even if you don't know the political system, understanding that you are a part, that you can be a part of this. And you know what has brought me to this work, honestly, I started activism or being engaged in the community to the extent that I am now out of necessity. I live, if you see right behind me, there's a no border wall sign, and in the introduction we spoke about how I was a part of the mobilization effort to really get people out into the street to protest the border wall, and we were successful in the cancellation of two contracts in our city, and two other contracts in our region. So really, like there was no other option for me but to join this fight and to really jump in with everything I had. I live about 1,000 feet away from the Rio Grande, so Mexico is right behind me, 1,000 feet away. So really, and the wall would have cut straight through this community. But what has sustained me through this work, and I think it was I kind of touched on it. It's my family. No, and this I'll say Spanish for everyone, because Laredo is a predominantly Spanish-speaking city. Lo que me sostiene en nuestra lucha es entendiendo que muchas veces nosotros no deberíamos de ser parte del sistema político. Nosotros no deberíamos de tener acceso. Mi familia vino a los Estados Unidos como braceros y trabajaron en los campos para harvesting the food that fed America for so many generations, and it is only until now that we are able to actually engage in the political system, because, like I said, we were never really meant to be part of this this process, yet we are here and we are willing to stand up for our community.
Thank you so much, Juan. That was amazing. I just really quickly want to say that, my deep belief in democracy is founded in a belief in human rights. And so that manifests both anger and love. And so I think that, my experience, since growing up and learning about the inequities and injustices in my area and elsewhere really manifested both the anger, but also reminded me how much I love, the people who I'm around and the people who I work with now. And what keeps me in that work is the community, right? Is that it's not sort of life and activism, it's the work at the intersection. And so that for me is what has really sustained this work for quite a long time and keeps me in it every day, because I know it affects people who I love and kind of keeps that anger going pretty regularly.
Thank you very much, Abby and Juan, for sharing your stories and why you are involved in this process. And something that keeps kind of resonated from the past to present is the fact that, it's very true that we were not meant to be part of this, process, right? I mean, we have come a long ways, right, to fight, for our right to vote. And 2020 elections were, quite a precedent. We had near record numbers of young people voting. However, there's still an issue in our democracy in America and how we're really going into rural America and how we're engaging young people. I continuously heard about the importance of voter registration. However, I think that there continues to be this misconception of rural America where rural communities are kind of placed to be homogeneous, right? But rural America is very diverse. We have our own identity, our values, and set of issues. How do you talk to people in rural America? And then the second piece to that question would be, what challenges do young people in rural areas and small cities face? Don't be shy, anyone can jump in.
I think that the way that we talk to people in rural America is we meet them where they are. As Amanda said in my introduction, I work with about 20 groups in my role as the Black Voters Matter state organizing manager. And every one of those groups are different. Every one of the leaders in those groups are different. They all have a common goal. The 80% of the groups that I work with are in rural areas across our state because we're very rural. We have very broad rural area, and we basically have 4 or 5 different types of rural in Mississippi. And so you just have to, I go in with an open mind, and I try to figure out where everyone is and try and meet them at that level to have an open, honest conversation with them, so that they can feel that I'm really reaching out to fill them and their communities, and to be supportive about where they are and how to move what their issues are forward. And ultimately, my goal is to help promote democracy, to help increase the number of African American voters who are engaged in that process. And I think that rural people in general, and Marlene, you mentioned how rural people are pretty much perceived to be as one and easily defined. Well, I think, as I said, they're all different, and they're anything but that. And that young people have, they're so spread out, they're small communities. They oftentimes may have challenges with connectivity around broadband, internet, watching the wrong TV news. I know that a lot of people in rural areas feel that they get their education around electoral issues from TV news, which is, I think, a discredit to them. And I think that there needs to be more homegrown opportunities for young people in communities to feel connected to the rest of the world and to the rest of our country about what is going on and what the real lay of the land is, and the roles that they can play in actually making a difference in their own communities and bringing about community change. My whole life, I've always thought about their rules, and these rules need to apply universally, and they should actually help to change the playing field or level the playing field for everyone who's engaged.
My connection with young people is similar to Carol's. I find that it's best to go into the neighborhoods. We do a lot in the churches. We pass out material when there's an election, when we feel that there's a need to register people that haven't been registered. In fact, I got 3 people who just moved in my community, and I'm gonna contact them directly. I do a lot of contact with young people because I'm a former school teacher through social media. I got me a whole group in this city, got me a group in this city, and got a group. And when we want to have a rally, a lot of times I want to get them out to rallies and things that we're having. I just get on the social media app, and they don't always show up, but we do get people to show up that way and to come out. And I do this also with issues that are coming up to be voted on. I tell them what the issues are and who perhaps may be the best candidate to vote for. I don't tell them who to vote for, but I give them a little background information about the person that are running. We recently had a supervisor's election, and a lot of people didn't know these people, but I knew how they had voted. Some were incumbent and some were new leaders, and new candidates. I do that, and I have gone into schools and passed out voter registration applications to seniors, left it with the secretary or the principal to pass out to them. And what I usually do, when I get them to fill out an application, I always go back and pick it up. I don't trust them to mail it in. So usually I just give them out, go back, pick them up. If I don't do it on the spot, I pick them up and return them to the courthouse myself. Those are ways that I reach young people. And like I said, through the church, you have to go in these churches, and not a whole lot of people are there, but you can make connection with their parents, and you can ask them about who is resident in the household and who is not. We do rallies. I've done several rallies with Carol, and we have the new Black Panther Party participating in every rally that we've had. In every meeting that we have, they always show up. Those are a group of young people that a lot of people who haven't associated with them, they are trying, and I think we're going to try to embrace that group also. I do telephone calls, but my greatest success has been meeting people and talking with them in their neighborhoods and in their homes and on the street. I do that too. We meet a lot of young people on the street and we ask them, are you registered to vote? And a lot of times there's that, no ma'am, I got a, what is it, a felony? I said, but is your felony, does it stop you from voting? When they tell me what it is, most times it's drugs. And I said, no, you can register to vote. We just get them where we can, where they are.
Thank you for that, Ms. Cunningham. And I know we have a lot of conversations around disenfranchisement. I know this is what you were talking about near the end about, people not knowing what kind of crime, they're just the impressions that we have from years of civic abuse. I was thinking while you were talking, I was thinking about Juan, and I was thinking, you talked about how special it was for you and your family to experience your mom learning the preamble or learning that part of the Constitution. Was it only family that, do you remember your defining moment or this moment that sparked in you, I need to get out and do something, right? Because a lot of times people hear stuff in their heads and maybe I can send a tweet or, but I know you were out there on the front lines as a young person. And so did you have a moment like that? And do your peers have moments like that? Like what's driving y'all right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always kind of had this political mindset. I know it started around high school. It wasn't really cultivated, but I had an opinion, or I was able to form an opinion. It wasn't always the opinion I would stand by now, but it was definitely I was like the process of really thinking critically about the world around me. And I started that was in high school. I did experience that, and then through college, I was involved on campus, and I did kind of receive some training from the student government on how to leaflet and how to approach people about certain issues and how to hold information sessions. So I did kind of have that. I did go to college and I did experience that. And yes, I do have friends that are political animals. My friend Tanya Benavides, she's running for Congress up against almost 20 years incumbent. So yeah, we're using the skills that we know, the skills that we've acquired up until this point in our lives to really get out there and really to kind of talk about the assumed homogeneity of of the border. It's rural America, but it's also the border, and I think it's one of those communities that were just assumed we were going to always vote within a certain block. And for this, I'll kind of talk about what my first canvassing experience. So I had done a lot of leafletting and talked to people outside of businesses and stuff, but I had never actually gone to knock on someone's door to find them and to talk to them. So this was in a town just south of Laredo, and it was an interesting experience, and I'll use it just to juxtapose kind of like that hopeful hope, like youthful hope for the future, and really what has become because of this process of assumed homogeneity and this and in really not and taking advantage of voters and taking them for granted. So in this conversation, it was canvassing for for the border wall, and it was to talk to a property owner or a small property like a homestead owner that was going to be impacted by border wall construction. And he basically was very pessimistic about our intention, not so much our intention, but what we were able to accomplish. And he was kind of telling us that all these problems that have arisen have been, you know, all these politicians and all these campaigns have continuously come through election after election. They ask for votes and then they leave, but they never fix anything. And at the same time, not so much that life is getting worse, but life is, you know, becoming more dynamic, and there are no solutions that are being delivered other than border militarization, because that's a thing, and mass incarceration. And I say that because he specifically pointed towards like the 1994 crime bill that was sponsored by President Joe Biden, and that's kind of where he was coming from. And at the end, we weren't really there to talk about like the election. We were there to talk about the wall, but he basically like told us that to keep fighting because he believed in us, but at the there is going to be a point where we might realize that, you know, things might not change unless we and I think that's where our drive even comes from now, like well, now that I had that conversation, now things need to change so that I don't grow up to have that mentality, and so that people can actually have faith in democracy. So yeah, that was one of the experiences that I had. And in terms of talking to young people, I will say that there's a lot of energy in Laredo and in the surrounding areas, and in Zapata County and in Webb County. There is a lot of the volunteers that I've worked with that have come out to knock on doors, to talk to people, have all been people that are not of age to vote. So they're 15, 16, 17-year-olds that saw a post on social media, and they don't even know who's on the ballot or what the election is about. They just know that the wall is, because we were doing the wall, they just know that that's an issue, that they don't want that here, and they're willing to go out and learn so that they can so that they can do their part and engage in the way that they can until they're eligible to vote.
There is so much enthusiasm in your voice and the way that you tell your story that it can't be ignored. That I know that same enthusiasm and fire is when you are knocking on people's doors and, you know, calling and texting and galvanizing your community. So I just want to thank you and celebrate you for that. And let you know, you were talking about what you did in high school and college, and I was like, how old are you now? Because you, to me, I'm like, you are just getting started. Like, what do you mean? So I just wanted to compliment you. You got a long way to go. And to thank you for that. And I want to remind the audience to submit questions into the chat or into the portal. If you have anything that you want to ask the panelists or ask myself or Marlene, drop your questions, because we want to try to answer those too. So thank you all for that beautiful response. I'm going to turn it over to my homegirl Marlene.
Yes. So this conversation, again, it's, really, thank you all for sharing this. And, I want to kind of turn it to Abby, because I think, there is a lot of energy in the communities. We're seeing a lot of, community outreach and education happening. We're seeing, Ms. Cunningham, you mentioned about a new group, the Black Panthers movement, kind of bringing that back up. Carol, you're doing so much with Black Voter Matters work, Juan, and the border wall. So there's this energy that is in rural America, right? So what is, taking all that into account, Abby, what role did the 2020 elections play in rural voting patterns, and what lessons can be taken away to generate more rural voter turnout?
Well, thank you so much, Marlene, and thanks for everyone for this great conversation. I mean, you talking about the energy that's there, this is one of the things that we see in data when we regularly collect it. So for example, in our post-election survey after the 2020 election, we heard from BIPOC youth in rural areas. 8 in 10 youth said it's my responsibility to get involved and make things better for society. And almost 8 in 10 rural BIPOC youth also said people like me should participate in political activities and decision making of this country, right? So the interest is there. But what we've seen election cycle after election cycle is that the access isn't there. That there is a huge rift in what some people, especially folks, in philanthropy, think is the issue and what's actually the issue. And so we saw historic turnout, as you've mentioned, in 2018 and 2020, historic youth turnout since the 26th Amendment was passed. But what we don't see in that data is the differences in access amongst young people. And this is why we haven't yet fulfilled the vision of the 26th Amendment. And so, Virginia just had an off-year gubernatorial election. And so one of the things that my colleague Kelly did before this election was look at 2020 turnout in Virginia. And what we saw was that the places where there was higher youth voter turnout are the places in the exurbs of Northern Virginia and the real urban areas of Virginia. And youth voter turnout was lower in the rural areas. And we actually have this data for 2016 and 2018 at the county level on our website if people are interested in checking that out. And one of the things that I think is really critical to understanding this is that when people are reaching out to young folks, right? And I hope we can talk about this. Usually it's like parachuting into communities, right? And not investing in the homegrown efforts that Ms. Blackman was talking about, or the youth leadership that Juan has been talking about. And so, in 2018 and 2020, we believe that the data shows that it was young people who were leading this historic increase in turnout, and especially young Black and Latinx women who were leading movements around issues. And so if we really want to learn from what happened in 2018 and 2020, we need to shift our thinking around elections entirely. And our director talks about it as shifting from thinking about mobilizing people to thinking about growing voters. Right? Where young people matter regardless of who you think they're going to vote for, or whether or not you think that they're going to vote at all, right? Regardless of race, family background, neighborhood. And, again, like Ms. Cunningham suggested, this means being proactive instead of reactive, right? Instead of focusing elections and outreach on people who voted already, let's focus on supporting people who've never voted. It means having year-round conversations and not waiting until the last 3 months before an election to reach out to people. And so this is one of the things that we call growing voters. And a perfect example of it was what Juan just talked about with respect to young people before they're eligible to vote, or maybe not even eligible to vote, participating in elections, right? And so how can we think about a more robust strategy to invest in things that are homegrown per Ms. Blackman, that are growing voters per Juan, and that are real proactive per Ms. Cunningham? Because these are the lessons that we've learned over and over again in 2020 and before, that we need to invest in young leaders and we need to invest in the work of communities that's going to sustain any election cycle.
To add to this question, I think and to kind of build on the last question and tying it into this one, there's just like this assumed, like in South Texas, it's always been assumed that we would vote in a certain, like we're a voting bloc that votes a certain way. And what you saw in this past election is that there is, an effort to mobilize and to get new voters that have never voted out to vote, and it's giving them something to vote for. But we saw that the vote for like the Democratic Party remained constant. But what we saw in 2020 in South Texas was an increase of new voters voting for the former president. So basically saying that, yeah, there is like this strategy has been identified and it's being utilized to the advantage of one party. And unfortunately, what I saw and what I experienced, because I was out running, I was like trying to organize and get out the vote in 2020 is that there was, like Abby said, this last minute surge of money coming in. It wasn't even 3 months. I wish it would have been 3 months. It was like two or 3 weeks right before the election. The strategy that was being used by employed by the national progressives and the Democratic Party was, let's just infuse as much money and see where it takes us, because there was this hope that if we get enough voters energized at the last minute in South Texas, we could flip Texas, because there is enough voters here to do that. But obviously, like Abby said, they're coming in. They came in three weeks before the election, bringing in, Bernie Sanders was doing phone banking. There was Kamala Harris went down to the Rio Grande Valley. The chair of the Democratic Party was here in Laredo the Sunday right before Election Day. But again, this is all happening right before the election. I had already voted by that time. A lot of people's votes had already been cast, and it wasn't like was mentioned. It wasn't enough to really leave an imprint on people's minds as to why they should vote for that person or for this set of ideas and for these set of values. It was just kind of throw money at it to see if it works. And the Republican Party does have this strategy kind of under and they are building this strategy, and they're investing in resources locally. They have a community center here. They've built a community center here in Laredo, and they're building another one in McAllen, which is just south of in the Rio Grande Valley, so that they can train people to organize to get people to register to vote, to build momentum around conservative values. So, and because we were just assumed to always vote Democratic, the Democrats didn't have that, and now they're playing catch up and trying to really get to that level of investment and really reclaim the space. And it's going to take some time and a lot of effort, and really that grassroots organizing to get that to that point that where we should have been, but we weren't at because we didn't have a long-term strategy here in South Texas.
I'd like to also respond to that as well, and to expand a little bit on what Black Voters Matter does. I talked about the fact that we have these partners across the states where we work, and we're in the Deep South and Southeastern states, but we're also in Michigan, some parts of Texas, and in Michigan. And so what we do with our groups, and we will oftentimes work with nonprofit organizations, C3 organizations, but what we do is provide them with mini grant support to help them build their capacity around their engagement level in democracy, so that they have the resources on the ground year around to go out into communities, to work with people, to provide training. We not only have our senior organizing managers, but we also have what we call regional organizers that work to assist the senior organizing managers in our states. We oftentimes find ourselves not only countering what is taking place nationally around voter suppression, but quite often in small rural communities, there are these targeted efforts where leaders in the community who are engaged in voter registration, voter turnout, voter mobilization find themselves being charged erroneously with voter fraud. And they're in these teeny little communities with maybe only a weekly newspaper. The television stations seldom go into these communities to follow up on any kind of news story. So the folk end up in real trouble, and the prosecutors who charge them with these voter fraud issues would then say to them, "Oh, let us offer you a plea bargain." So quite often these folk would end up taking a plea bargain. Sometimes it means that they can't run for office again, or if they're in office, they have to leave that office. But at a minimum, they really don't have the wind beneath their wings to take them back into the arena to continue the work that they have been doing. For example, we've had a few towns here in Mississippi where elections have been recalled and have been revoted, where judges have gone in and said, oh, they're going to have to revote in this election, that election, not the entire election, but only in certain wards or certain seats or positions in those areas. We've even had a young woman here who was charged with voter fraud and witness intimidation. Well, she went to court. They found, excuse me, they found her innocent of the voting fraud charge, but they found her guilty of witness intimidation. And lo and behold, the judge set her sentencing at 15 years. And the woman who she was accused of intimidating as a witness testified at trial that no, she didn't intimidate me. I've known her since she was a kid. But the judge gave her 15 years with 12 years to serve. Her case went to the appellate court. The appellate court said that the circuit court had erred, so they actually threw the conviction out. And then, lo and behold, our state attorney general became involved in the case and called for the appellate court to rehear the case, which they did, and said again that she was not guilty of what they said she was with the witness intimidation. The case went to the Mississippi Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that they thought that they were the wrong venue to be hearing it. And so now it's still in limbo. Meanwhile, this young woman who has spent almost 3 years in a Mississippi prison sits in prison after the appellate court says she's not guilty, while all of this is being played out, where in these small communities, those kinds of cases are actually tampering down the number of voters who show up at the polls. There was a recent election in that community in 3 wards, and fewer than 500 people went out to vote.
Brief comment on what Carol has said. We had the same situation in Aberdeen, next door to me here, and the election was overturned. But the point I want to make is that in 1964, we had voter suppression, but really, you still got voter suppression today. We are experiencing a lot of voter suppression with these elections that have been overturned because they are fraud, witness tampering. We haven't moved very far from where we were, is the point I want to make. And if we're going to move, I think we're going to have to try to do what Abby is saying, get young people involved. And the way to get them involved is to get them to run and to get something on get some issues that affect young people to run on. Because I had so many people wanting to vote this year because the marijuana initiative was on the ballot care. We had people turn out, and then I was looking at some stats about 2008. We had a 49% increase of young people voting that year, more than any other group. So we got to give these people something to vote for.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Cunningham and Ms. Blackman. Thank you, everyone, for all of the input that you have put in this conversation. If you could really quickly give us your bottom line as it pertains to the rural vote and rural youth vote, something like, if you had to complete this sentence, what would you complete it with? And the sentence might be, rural communities need blank to blank. How about that? Because I think everyone has said so much. I have heard so much from each of you about needs assessments and what's really happening and what's going on there. And then if you could also tell the audience how they can keep in touch with you, if they have some questions about your journey or some insight that they might be seeking. What do you think, Marlene? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think there were so many points that you all made today. And I think one of the most critical things, is that I'm going to take kind of back to what Abby had mentioned about the data, right? Where there is still a need to have more civic engagement opportunities in rural communities. There are so many young people, especially in rural areas, that are energetic, want to get involved, but we still see these deserts, in the study that you conducted, right, with your organization, Abby, 60% of rural communities live in civic deserts compared to 30% for urban and suburban communities. So there's clearly a civic opportunity gap for rural voters and in general, just rural young voters, right? And that is really the ask with this, is like, we need to make more investment in rural communities. We need to make sure that, that young people who are in rural areas, they are engaged, they are facing challenges, they are pushing the needle to really, make their communities better, but there is a lack of investment. And I think you hit it right in the target, Juan, when you mentioned, and as well, Carol and Cunningham, it's the people on the ground who are doing this work. And I think that we're at a point where we're frustrated. I come from a rural area too, where we have national organizations, politicians that just come 3 months to 6 months, come and go. And then at the end of the day, who's picking up the crumbs? And I don't want to be offensive in that way, but that's the truth. It's us who are in those communities, organizing, engaging, doing the outreach, right? And want to make sure that doesn't happen, that there's really actually pipelines being created. Because that's another thing, right? That's across generational lines. For political fault lines really have sort of felt, in the sense, they're not creating leadership pipelines for young rural people to be leaders. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. I think that could be another conversation itself. But going back to what Amanda said, we're hitting that time. So yeah, that bottom line, what is that ask? What to the audience, to organizations, to national groups out there, what do they need to do to really invest in rural communities? And then how can they get in touch with all of you, right? And learn more about the work that you're doing in your communities. Mm-hmm.
I think that that the same level of investment in rural community democracy needs to be paid that is being paid to military recruitment from rural communities. And I think that foundations should invest in small rural organizations and organizational infrastructure. I think quite often that doesn't happen enough, that foundations look more broadly at investing in larger organizations and in, I forgot my thought, but I think that we need to have investments in small rural communities. I think that government needs to make those investments around democracy. We think about the number of leaders who are long-term leaders in, say, in Congress, who emanate from small rural communities. For example, our own congressman from Mississippi, Congressman Benny Thompson, comes from a very small town in Mississippi of fewer than 1,000 residents. So I think that there needs to be particular focus on actually mobilizing and engaging rural America, which makes up roughly 3/4 of the whole country.
Adding to what Kira said, I agree with what she said. I think we need an issue, incentive to draw their attention to the electoral process. I don't know whether that means running a candidate, investing in a candidate, to do that, investing in some kind of issue that, young people want to accomplish. But I think we got to give them a reason to vote too.
I think that, well, I'll speak for rural communities, but also like border communities. Like Laredo's a small city and it's surrounded by pretty rural, very large, expansive rural areas. And I'll say that rural communities need to be centered in the conversations that where decisions are being made, and their voices need to be centered in these conversations in order to build these long-lasting social movements and relationships. And I'll use an example to kind of illustrate what that means. So I was in a call with a progressive organization a couple of weeks ago, and I was one of two people from the community, and the whole time they were talking, they were like, we want to hear from people in the community. We want to hear from people in the community. We want to hear from the people in the community. That was said so many times in that call. And they directed questions at me that I was going to answer. But as soon as I started answering that question, they said, the moderator, which is not from our community, she unmuted herself and she was like, Juan, we don't have time to talk about that. And ultimately, and that just goes to show that there's these national organizations that are want to parachute in for an election, want to parachute in for a very limited time to perform a very limited function. They're not really, while they say that they want to hear from the community, oftentimes the culture of this national political conversation pushes out the people that are most impacted by the decisions that are made. And I think that's why, when we talk about disillusionment in the political process and the conversation that I spoke about earlier from my canvassing, it just those are the kinds of things that push people away. And it's really flipping that over and saying, no, we're actually going to value the input of people here. And that is what we're going to base ourselves off of, not whatever interests and whatever money is that we're trying to follow. It's the people, and that's what we really need to be prioritized.
To Juan's point, I can't stop thinking about this idea of belonging. And I know that this is something that the Rural Youth Catalyst Project is talking a good bit about, because, Marlene, you've talked about the interest, right? There is so much interest, so much energy. And sometimes that connecting interest to action is through belonging, right? Feeling part of something larger. And actually, in the past 2 elections, it's been a little relatively high amongst young people. After the 2020 election, we heard 2/3 of BIPOC youth in rural areas said they feel part of a group or movement that votes to express their views. But that can be so much higher. So much higher. And I really agree with what Ms. Blackman said about infrastructures and supports that promote belonging, right? And that can look a lot of different ways in different communities, but the support and the youth leadership to be able to build that culture is truly, truly critical.
One place you could start is really with school boards. I've always wondered why, youth were not on school boards.
Agreed.
And, yeah, that's somewhere to start with if you're talking about infrastructure.
And Ms. Cunningham, you're hitting the nail right there. It's local governance. How do we bring it back, to that local movement building?
I'm so happy to hear that from all of you. I'm in the background trying to catch my kids' school bus, but I'm here. So I like the way you brought it all into what's local, because that's what's home. And I think the larger part of this conversation is about how to serve your home, how to serve your community, how to activate what's already there. We already have the tools and the resources. We have the language, we have the wisdom of the people who have gone before us and are still with us, and we have the ingenuity of the young people like Juan that are out here now. I want to thank y'all for joining us for this beautiful conversation. I know that you can find ways to connect with us through links that have been posted and information that has been shared. This is such a joy and such an honor. And I just wanted to say thanks. I'm going to hand it over to Marlene for her thanks, and then See y'all when we see you.
Also here, again, just an honor to be, among such brilliant, amazing leaders, activists. And thank you everyone for tuning in to this really important conversation. This is just an initiation. Please go home and have more conversations. And for those who are watching, remember, invest in rural communities, rural youth matter, rural voters matter. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I want to say a huge thank you for the time and energy and thought that you put in. And to the audience, we hope that this is just the beginning of this conversation for all of you. I'd like to leave you with a quote from the late Congressman John Lewis. And when asked about the role of young people in voting rights, one of the things he said is, "What I try to tell young people is that if you come together with a mission, and it's grounded with love and a sense of community, you can make the impossible possible." And this whole conversation has been a reflection on a celebration, what we've achieved, but also the long road that we have to go. An enormous thank you to the shoulders that we stand on of our panelists today. And to all of you in the audience, we hope that you'll stay with us in this work. If you're not already signed up for the Rural Assembly newsletters, please make sure that you do that. That gives you access to the ongoing newsletters that tells you about ongoing issues, events. You can tune into the Everywhere Radio podcast with Whitney Kimball Co. You can get weekly advocacy alerts. And then the next Rural Assembly live stream will be in January, and it's with the Health Action Alliance, and it will focus on how rural businesses can support employees with children to take the time they need to get their children vaccinated. Also, we talked about the limited news sources available for rural communities and rural young people, so we strongly encourage you to sign up and follow the Daily Yonder if you're not already getting into it. It is a very fresh perspective, and it's online news that brings you commentary and analysis for rural America to all the people in all the places. And last but not least, you should have seen the Circle website dropped in the chat box, but we hope that you'll follow along with the events and the research and the resources that they offer. And then, of course, we always welcome your collaboration with us at the Rural Youth Catalyst Project. We love to hear your ideas. We ask you to join forces with us. No idea is too big or too small. We're here to build opportunities for all our young people and to help every single young person realize their hopes and dreams. So we hope you have a great afternoon. And again, an enormous thank you to Circle for partnering with us and collaborating to make this happen, for the Rural Assembly for making all of this platform and all of our outreach and our ability to do this work possible, and to all of you as panelists for your incredible work, and to Marlene and Amanda for your brilliant facilitation. Thank you, everyone.